Have you ever wondered why the most powerful air force in the world, the 1940 Luftwaffe, couldn't manage to destroy a series of stationary 360-foot steel towers sitting right on the English coast? To the German High Command, these structures were obsolete, but that assumption was the fatal error that cost Hitler the war. While the world watched the dogfights in the clouds, a silent battle was being waged in the electromagnetic spectrum, a battle of pips, blips, and impossible physics. We are uncovering the secret history of the chain home stations and the Yanks who arrived in secret to master a technology so advanced it effectively moved the horizon. It's time to look at the invisible shield that redefined modern warfare.
If you close your eyes and think of the Battle of Britain, what do you see? Most of us see the same image, a handful of young men in silk scarves climbing into the cockpits of Spitfires and Hurricanes, rising to meet a dark cloud of Luftwaffe bombers over the white cliffs of Dover. It's a stirring image, the few standing against the many. But if we look at the cold, hard mathematics of 1940, that image is dangerously incomplete. History suggests that valor alone doesn't win wars against a numerically superior foe. In fact, if the RAF had relied solely on the bravery of its pilots and the speed of its planes, the Battle of Britain would have been over in 3 weeks. The Spitfire, for all its grace, was a blind weapon. Without a way to see over the horizon, those pilots would have spent their precious fuel and engine hours patrolling empty skies, while the Luftwaffe struck where they weren't. The reality is that the British didn't just have better pilots, they had the world's first integrated data fusion network, Chain Home. While the public fixated on the planes, the British government was secretly erecting a curtain of electromagnetic energy. By 1940, a ring of 21 stations stood watch from the Orkneys to Weymouth. These weren't the sleek, spinning satellite dishes we think of today. They were massive, brutalist structures, 360-foot steel transmitter towers and 240-foot wooden receiver masts. To a German pilot flying across the channel, they looked like primitive radio towers, but these were the eyes of the nation. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding realized that radar was useless if the information stayed at the coast. He created a system that collected RDF, or radio direction finding, data, sent it via thousands of miles of private telephone lines to a central filter room, and turned raw blips into actionable intelligence. This gave the RAF the one thing money couldn't buy: time. While the Luftwaffe was still forming up over France, massing their Heinkel 111s and Junkers 88s, the British controllers already knew their altitude, their bearing, and their strength. This invisible shield meant the RAF didn't have to stay in the air 24/7. They could sit on the grass, engines off, until the exact moment they were needed. But here is the twist that few history books mention. As the Battle of Britain reached its fever pitch, the British were running out of the very thing they needed most to operate this shield: trained technical minds. But while the U.S. was officially neutral in 1940, a secret deal was being struck. Long before Pearl Harbor, a group of Americans, the Yanks, were already heading toward these towers. They weren't there to fly. They were there to learn the secret of the invisible pulse before their own coasts were threatened. In the late 1930s, the world was governed by a simple, terrifying rule of warfare: the bomber will always get through. This wasn't just a slogan, it was a mathematical certainty. If an enemy fleet of aircraft crossed the coast at 200 miles per hour, by the time a spotter on the ground heard the engines and picked up a telephone, the bombs were already falling. To stop them, you had to see them coming while they were still over the ocean, hundreds of miles away. But there was a problem, a physical wall that science deemed unscalable. The Earth, as we know it, is a sphere. Light travels in straight lines. Therefore, anything beyond the horizon is hidden by the curvature of the planet. For a century, the greatest minds in physics believed that seeing an object 100 miles away was as impossible as looking through a brick wall. If you were a British scientist in 1935, you weren't just fighting the Nazis, you were fighting the laws of nature. You needed a way to bounce a signal off a metal object in the sky, have that signal return to a tiny receiver, and do it all at the speed of light. Many of us remember the first time we saw a microwave or a transistor radio. It felt like magic. But in 1935, the magic required to see through the horizon was so advanced it was effectively a state secret. The breakthrough didn't come from a death ray, which is what the British Air Ministry originally asked for. It came from a man named Robert Watson Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins, who realized that the interference seen on BBC radio transmissions wasn't a nuisance, it was a map.
They discovered that when a radio wave hits an aircraft, the metal airframe acts like a mirror. It scatters a tiny fraction of that energy back toward the source. This became the foundation of RDF, the precursor to radar. To make this work, the British built the chain home stations. These weren't your modern high-frequency radar dishes that rotate in circles. They were floodlight systems. Imagine a giant lighthouse that doesn't spin, but instead illuminates the entire sky in a 100-degree arc. The physics was brutal. These stations operated at high frequency, or HF bands, typically between 20 and 30 megahertz. This meant the wavelengths were long, about the size of a small house. To catch these massive waves, the British had to build towers that were equally massive. Think about the sheer engineering audacity. In an era before computers, these stations were emitting pulses of 600 kilowatts of power. That's enough energy to light up a small city, compressed into a burst lasting only 20 microseconds. But sending the signal was half the battle. The return signal, the echo bouncing off a Heinkel bomber, was billions of times weaker than the original pulse. It was like trying to hear a pin drop in the middle of a thunderstorm. To see this echo, the British developed the cathode ray tube display. For the Americans who eventually arrived at these stations, the sight of a CRT was like looking into the future. At the time, most U.S. radio technology was still reliant on mechanical dials and magic eye tuning tubes. Here, the British had a glowing green line, an A-scope, where a blip or pip would appear. By measuring the distance between the start of the trace and the blip, an operator could calculate the range of the enemy aircraft to within a mile. But the British took it a step further. They used a technique called goniometry. By comparing the signal strength between two different sets of receiving antennas, an operator could determine the exact bearing of the planes. This physics was elegant, but it was also incredibly temperamental. The towers were fixed, they couldn't move. If the Germans figured out how the math worked, they could simply fly under the beam or jam the frequency. But there was another limitation. The chain home system was so massive and complex that it required thousands of highly trained operators to interpret the flickering green lines. Britain was bleeding manpower. They had the physics, but they didn't have the hands. Therefore, they turned to their neutral cousins across the Atlantic. The Americans had the industrial might and a growing core of signal experts, but they were years behind in the practical application of radar. This friction created the most important secret exchange of the war. In the late summer of 1940, a man named Sir Henry Tizard sat on a bench in London watching the smoke rise from the horizon. He knew something the public didn't. Britain was winning the battle in the air, but losing the war of attrition. Their factories were being hammered, their treasury was nearly empty, and while their radar was brilliant, it was clunky. It required massive towers that couldn't be moved.
To win, they needed to shrink radar down to fit it inside a night fighter or the nose of a submarine hunting plane. The British had the brain, a revolutionary device that could do exactly that, but they lacked the body, the massive industrial assembly lines of Detroit and Pittsburgh to build it by the thousands. History often frames the US-UK relationship as one of a benefactor helping a victim, but in 1940 it was a desperate trade. Britain had the crown jewels of science, and they were about to give them away for free, hoping the gamble would bring the Americans into the fight. Many of us remember the old adage that you don't get something for nothing. For the British government, giving away their most guarded secrets was a terrifying risk. If the US remained neutral, or if the technology leaked to the Abwehr, the war was over. Yet Tizard packed a black metal trunk, boarded a ship under a cloud of secrecy, and headed for Washington. To the American scientists at the Tuxedo Park Laboratory who first saw it, the device looked like nothing more than a heavy copper whistle. But when they opened it up, they realized they were looking at a leap in technology equivalent to 100 years of research. While the Americans were struggling to generate microwave power measured in watts, this British whistle generated 10 kilowatts. It was 1,000 times more powerful than anything the Americans had ever seen. The magnetron was the key to microwave radar. Because the waves it produced were so small, centimeters rather than meters, the antennas no longer needed to be 360-foot steel towers. They could be small rotating dishes. This one device, handed over in a hotel room, is often cited by historians as the single most important gift in military history. It eventually allowed the Allies to spot a U-boat periscope from miles away in total darkness. But the Tizard mission wasn't just about hardware, it was about the protocol of cooperation. The British didn't just hand over the magnetron, they handed over the blueprints for the entire chain home system. They explained the filter room logic, the human-computer interface that processed data. The Americans were stunned. They had been working on their own system, the SCR-270, but it lacked the sophisticated height-finding capabilities of the British towers. By sharing these crown jewels, Tizard created a bridge. He convinced the Army Signal Corps that the future of Western civilization depended on a shared electronic language.
While the British were craftsmen, building each radar set like a fine watch, the Americans looked at the magnetron and saw something that could be stamped out like a Ford fender. Within months, Bell Labs and Western Electric were retooling entire divisions to produce what the British had invented in a small lab in Birmingham. The exchange of technology was a triumph of diplomacy. Therefore, the next logical step wasn't just shipping crates of vacuum tubes across the Atlantic, it was shipping people. The U.S. military realized that they couldn't just read a manual to understand how to fight an electronic war. They needed boots on the ground inside the British radar huts. They needed to see how the Yanks would perform when the blips on the screen weren't a simulation, but a formation of Luftwaffe bombers intent on destruction. But there was a diplomatic minefield to navigate. How do you send American officers into a British war zone when the United States is officially at peace? In the early months of 1941, the United States was a nation caught in a deep internal struggle. While the fires of the London Blitz were visible on every newsreel, the American public was fiercely divided. Men like Charles Lindbergh argued for isolationism, while President Roosevelt knew that if Britain fell, the Atlantic would become a German lake. There was a legal red line. American military personnel could not participate in hostilities without a declaration of war. However, a silent crisis was unfolding in the British chain home stations. The eyes of the nation were blinking. British operators were exhausted, and the technical complexity of the new equipment was outpacing the supply of trained technicians. Roosevelt and his advisors realized they couldn't wait for Pearl Harbor to learn how to fight a modern electronic war. They needed a live-fire classroom. Imagine the risk. If an American officer was captured or killed in a British radar tower during a Luftwaffe raid, it could spark a domestic political firestorm or give Hitler the pretext he needed to declare war on his own terms. Many of us who have served or worked in government understand the wink and the nod of a clandestine operation. To solve this, the U.S. military orchestrated one of the most clever and least discussed diplomatic end-arounds of the 20th century. The solution was the creation of the Electronics Training Group. The U.S. Army Signal Corps began recruiting young, brilliant officers and engineers, but with a strange caveat. They were told to pack civilian clothes and leave their uniforms behind. These men weren't sent to England as soldiers, they were sent as civilian technical observers. Their passports didn't list them as military rank, they listed them as engineers or instructors. When they arrived at the foggy, wind-swept chain home stations on the English coast, they weren't greeted with a formal military parade. Instead, they were quietly absorbed into the British Royal Air Force structure. By mid-1941, hundreds of Americans were embedded in the British radar network. They weren't just observing, they were sitting at the consoles. They were learning the flicker of the A-scope and the specific beat of a BMW 801 engine as it registered on the electronic grid. These Yanks were given a crash course in the reality of the Luftwaffe's tactics. They discovered that the Germans weren't just flying in a straight line, they were using zigzag maneuvers and early forms of electronic jamming. The Americans discovered that the British were using a secret device called the IFF, or Identification Friend or Foe, a transponder in the cockpit that pulsed a specific signal back to the radar. Without this, the Americans realized they would be shooting down their own pilots. This was the first time in history that American and British personnel shared a common operating picture. The Americans brought their knowledge of high-speed vacuum tubes and mass production, while the British provided the hard-won data of combat. One American observer famously wrote back to Washington that 1 month at a chain home station is worth 2 years at West Point. A particularly striking fact of this era is that these American observers were often the first to see the German raids forming up over the Pas-de-Calais. They were literally watching the potential destruction of London through a green electronic eye before the British pilots even had their engines warmed up. Despite being civilians, these men were under constant threat. The chain home towers, standing 360 feet tall, were the most obvious targets on the British coastline. The Luftwaffe knew these towers were important, even if they didn't fully understand how they worked. The Americans had to work through the shake and rattle of nearby 500-pound bombs, knowing that if they died, their presence in that tower would likely be buried in a classified folder for decades. This secret partnership was working perfectly. The U.S. was gaining a generation of radar experts, and the British were getting much-needed technical relief. But there was a fatal flaw in the German intelligence service's assessment of these towers. The Luftwaffe's high command, led by Hermann Göring, looked at the massive, exposed masts and made a strategic assumption that would ultimately cost them the war. They saw them as obsolete radio masts that were too difficult to hit and not worth the effort to destroy. Therefore, the Germans pivoted. They stopped focusing on the eyes of the British defense and started focusing on the arms, the airfields, and factories. This mistake was born from a total misunderstanding of the invisible shield. In the high-stakes game of military intelligence, the most dangerous thing you can do is to assume your enemy is as limited as you are. By 1940, the Luftwaffe was arguably the most modern air force in the world. They had the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a masterpiece of engineering, and they had perfected the Blitzkrieg across Europe. But they had a blind spot, a technological arrogance that led them to believe that if they hadn't mastered long-range detection, the British certainly hadn't either. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, actually conducted a Zeppelin mission before the war to sniff for British radar signals. But because the British chain home stations operated on such low frequencies, the HF band, the German equipment, which was looking for much higher, more advanced frequencies, missed them entirely. They concluded that the British had no radar at all. When the Battle of Britain began, the Luftwaffe's strategy was tragically flawed. On August 12, 1940, they launched a series of concentrated attacks on the radar stations at Ventnor, Pevensey, and Dover. They caused significant damage. At Ventnor, the station was knocked offline for weeks. The British were masters of deception. Instead of letting the Germans know the radar was down, they used a mobile spoofing transmitter to keep sending out signals from the same location. The Luftwaffe looked at their own monitoring equipment, saw the signals still active, and concluded that their bombs had been ineffective against these useless steel towers.
Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, famously declared in a staff meeting, "It is doubtful whether there is any point in continuing the attacks on the radar stations since not one of those so far attacked has been put out of operation." This was the moment the war turned. Because the Germans thought the towers were indestructible and of low value, they shifted their focus. They stopped hitting the radar stations and started hitting the RAF airfields and London itself. This gave the British technicians and the secret American observers embedded with them the breathing room they needed to keep the system running. The Americans watching this from inside the towers were learning a lesson that would define U.S. Cold War strategy, the importance of signature management. They saw that by hiding the true capability of a system, you could trick an enemy into abandoning a winning strategy. The Germans also failed to realize that the Yanks were helping the British refine a technique called frequency hopping. Whenever the Luftwaffe tried to jam the radar by flooding the airwaves with noise, the operators would simply hop to a slightly different frequency within the band. To the German jammers, it looked like the radar was simply immune to their efforts. The Luftwaffe's decision to stop attacking the towers was a massive blunder. But, even with the tower standing, the raw data they produced was just a mess of glowing lines and static. A radar station can tell you something is coming, but it can't tell you what to do about it. The real genius of the system wasn't in the steel towers or the physics of the pip. It was in a room filled with wooden maps, colored counters, and young women with headphones. This was the filter room, the brain of the invisible shield, and it was here that the Americans learned the art of modern command and control. Information is not intelligence. This is a lesson many of us learned the hard way in our careers, whether in business, the military, or even navigating the complexities of modern life. Having data is one thing, knowing what it means is quite another. In 1940, the British chain home towers were screaming information at a rate never before seen in human history. Each station was seeing pips, but those pips were often overlapping, distorted by weather, or confused by the sheer volume of aircraft in the sky. If you were a commander in the RAF, you couldn't just look at a radar screen and know where to send your planes. A single radar station at Dover might see a blip and report it at 15,000 feet, while a station at Pevensey saw the same group of planes and reported them at 18,000 feet. If you sent your pilots to the wrong altitude, they were sitting ducks. The chaos of the air war was a mathematical nightmare. To solve this, the British created the filter room. This was the secret heart of the doubting system, a windowless bunker where the fog of war was systematically burned away. For the American officers arriving in England, the filter room was the most impressive thing they had ever seen. It wasn't just a room, it was the world's first analog computer, made of wood, telephone wires, and human intuition. The filter room operated on a principle of triangulation and truth. Reports from all the chain home stations flowed into this central hub via high-priority telephone lines. At the center of the room was a massive map of the British coast, divided into a grid. Young women, mostly from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, stood around this table with long wooden rakes. As the radar reports came in, they would place colored plots on the map. The purple value that the Americans studied so intensely was the filtering process. Each plot had a color, red, yellow, or blue, representing the time it was received. By looking at the trail of colors, a filterer could see the direction and speed of a raid. But more importantly, the filterer had to decide which radar station was right. If Dover said 20 planes and Pevensey said 50, the filterer used their experience to weight the data, reconciling the conflicting reports into a single true track. Once a track was confirmed as hostile, it was given a unique number. This was the birth of modern air traffic control. For the first time, a commander could look at a table and see the entire war at a glance. They weren't guessing where the Germans were, they were watching them move in near real time, with a delay of only about 30 to 60 seconds. The Americans, men who would later go on to build the foundations of the U.S. Air Defense Command, were mesmerized by the information loop. They watched as the filter room passed the true data to the sector clock. This clock was divided into 5-minute color blocks. It ensured that the data on the table was never more than 5 minutes old. If a plot wasn't updated by the time the clock hand hit the matching color, it was swept away. This prevented ghost tracks from cluttering the map, a precursor to the refresh rate on the computer screens we use today. The American Yanks realized that the filter room was also a psychological weapon. Because the RAF commanders knew exactly where the enemy was, they could keep their pilots on the ground longer. This ground-controlled interception, or GCI, saved thousands of hours of engine wear and kept pilots fresh. While the Luftwaffe was flying blind patrols, the RAF was sniping from the ground. The filter room transformed raw electronic noise into mathematical certainty. Therefore, the British and their American observers weren't just reacting to the war, they were managing it. They had turned the sky into a chessboard where they always had the last move. But as the war progressed, the nature of the threat changed. The Germans began to realize they were being watched, leading to a new era of electronic warfare and night bombing. The chain home stations had to evolve, and the legacy of the men and women who manned them would eventually cross the ocean to become the backbone of American Cold War defense.
History is rarely a straight line. It is a series of handoffs. Many of us remember the transition from the vacuum tube to the transistor, or the way the heavy cast-iron machinery of our youth gave way to the sleek, silent silicon of today. We often look at the giants of the past, the great steel towers of the chain home stations, and see them as relics of a bygone era, like the hulls of wooden warships. But if you look closely at the DNA of our modern world, you realize that those rusted towers never really went away. They simply evolved. The lessons learned by those American Yanks in the foggy marshes of Essex and the cliffs of Dover didn't just stay in England. They were carried back across the Atlantic in the minds of young officers who would become the architects of the Cold War. The central problem of 1940, how to detect a threat over the horizon and coordinate a response in seconds, didn't disappear when the Luftwaffe retreated. It became the defining challenge of the nuclear age. If the bomber could always get through in 1940, the stakes in 1955 were infinitely higher. A single plane didn't just mean a hole in a city block, it meant the end of a civilization. Therefore, the invisible shield had to grow, and it had to become much, much faster. When the Americans returned home after the war, they took the concept of the filter room, the map table, and the wooden rakes, and realized it could no longer be done by hand. The manual plotting of the WAFs was the direct ancestor of the first digital computers. The U.S. military, drawing on the experience of those who saw the British system in action, commissioned IBM to build the SAGE system. It was the largest computer ever built, occupying an entire floor of a hardened bunker. But its brain was doing exactly what the filter room did. It was taking disparate radar signals, filtering the noise, and presenting a true track to a commander. The American Yanks who trained on chain home understood something fundamental. Integration is more important than the individual sensor. This led to the creation of the DEW line, Distant Early Warning Line. Stretching across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland, the DEW line was effectively chain home on a global scale. It used the same height-finding math and the same IFF protocols that were refined in the heat of the Blitz. Think of the microwave oven in your kitchen. It is a direct descendant of that Cavity Magnetron Tizard brought over in a black trunk. Every time you heat a cup of coffee, you are using the exact same technology that allowed a British night fighter to find a German bomber in the pitch black of 1941. Even the concept of stealth is a response to the chain home legacy. Modern planes like the F-22 or the B-2 are designed specifically to defeat the reflective physics that Watson Watt and his trainees mastered. We spend decades learning how to see. Now we spend billions learning how to be invisible to the very eyes we created. The story of the Yanks at the chain home stations is a story of a baton being passed. The British provided the desperate necessity and the brilliant spark of invention. The Americans provided the industrial scale and the computational future. When we look at the modern world, from the GPS on our phones to the air traffic control systems that keep our grandchildren safe in the sky, we aren't just looking at tech. We are looking at the echoes of 1940. We are looking at the legacy of a few hundred young men in civilian clothes who stood in shivering towers watching a green line flicker and realizing that the future of the free world was a matter of math, pulses, and the courage to see what was coming. It is often said that we stand on the shoulders of giants. In the case of the radar war, those giants were made of steel and stood 360 feet tall against a gray Atlantic sky. To the men of that generation, the invisible shield wasn't just a gadget. It was the difference between a world in shadows and a world in light. They watched the horizon, so we wouldn't have to. And as the last of those towers are reclaimed by the sea air, their invisible pulses still ripple through every corner of our lives today. History is only as permanent as the people who remember it. If you found value in this deep dive into the invisible shield, I'd ask you to do two things. First, join our community by subscribing. We're dedicated to uncovering the technical and human stories that the standard history books often gloss over. But more importantly, I want to hear from you in the comments. Many of you watching likely served in the Signal Corps, worked with early radar systems, or have family stories from this era. Your first-hand knowledge is the missing data that keeps this history alive for the next generation. Let's keep the conversation going.